Hello, everybody. We have Michael Gaines here. He's the author of The Shortest Dynasty, the story of Robert Portner, the history of his brewing empire, and the story of his beloved Annaburg. He holds degrees in history, specializing in historic preservation, and he's currently a BFA candidate in studio art. He graduates in May from Appalachian State University. So welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Nikolai, for having me. It's great to be here.
So I wondered if we could start by giving us a brief history on Annaburg Manor and Robert Portner. If you could explain why it's so important to local history and maybe even national history.
Absolutely. So let's see. It's trying to decide where to start on the story. It's he he came to Manassas originally in 1872 as a visitor. He had visited the estate of Christian Mathis, whose wife had befriended Robert Portner's wife on their journey over from Switzerland, and they were just guests. It was through Anna's brother Peter that they were trying to arrange a business partnership with Christian Mathis, and so they came to visit. They liked the area, and then eventually Mr. Mathis passed away. And by about 1883, Robert was looking for just a way to sort of escape the oppressive heat of the city, both Alexandria and Washington, and to relieve his stresses of his business life. And the Mathis estate had really impressed upon him. Plus, with its view of the Bull Run Mountains at the time, it reminded Anna Portner of her homeland in Switzerland. So they ended up purchasing the estate, which was 4 parcels that equaled 191 acres that had been part of the Liberia estate. So they turned that into their summer home, originally using the Mathis house that was there. And then by about 1890, the house had gotten too small for the growing family. They were up to 10 children by that point. No, I'm sorry, 12 children by that point. So the house had gotten a little small, so he was ready to expand it. So he had eventually moved the house back while he designed and built his new house. The cornerstone was laid in April of 1892, and it was finished by about December of 1894. And rather than just demolish the original Mathis house, Portner sold it, and it was moved off of the property, and it was moved to the corner of East and Quarry Streets, which is where it sits today and is commonly known as the Henson House. So as he continued to own Annaburg, he just continued purchasing more and more land around the estate. The bulk of Annaburg comprised large portions of the Liberia estate of the Ware family, as well as the majority of the McLean Yorkshire estate. So the property ended up going from Main Street, Manassas, all the way up to the waters of Bull Run. So at its peak, it comprised a little over 2,100 acres, and the vast majority of it was a working farm. The estate really speaks to Portner's intellect because he was able to utilize all aspects of the farm, both for pleasure and for agrarian purposes, but he did so without repeating himself. So like he had a 300-acre fenced-in deer park for pleasure, but he also had his dairy farm. He raised cattle. He had several acres of orchards. He had a vineyard that he used to make wine in DC, but he never repeated himself. So it's not like he had one vineyard over here and another vineyard over there. It was all just different things. And he made the most out of the estate. When he purchased it, it was all battle-scarred land because it was a big part of the Civil War. And so he was able to really turn it around and recultivate it. When he built Annaburg, he included all the modern conveniences of the time that he could. He had already electrified his brewery in Alexandria, which was the first place to be electrified there. So when he built Annaburg, he incorporated electrical lighting into the house. The house had indoor plumbing, both of which were really big novelties at the time. But the biggest thing, which Annaburg is probably most well known for, is it is believed to be the first house in the country to have air conditioning. He had invented a beer cooling process that basically pumped ammonia through pipes. And within those pipes were pipes that had the beer. So through direct ammonia expansion, it really kept the beer nice and cold. So he basically incorporated that process when he built Annaburg. And so he installed these copper pipes in the wall They just pumped all this ice cold water through them. And his grandson, Robert Portner III, who was later a resident of the nursing home, said that it was so effective that the house was like an icebox, even in the dead of summer. So Annaburg is basically believed to be the first house in the country to have air conditioning. So that's, I mean, I think that from an engineering aspect, that's why it's really important to both local and national history. Um, it's one of the few pieces of opulent Victorian architecture left in Northern Virginia. So it definitely has that big historical connotation architecturally. Um, but also it's a testament to Robert Portner and his life, his business acumen, and his generosity. There's not a lot left standing architecturally of his legacy, um, and so I think that's another reason why it's important to preserve it. Like I said, the majority of his estate was a working farm, but the 20 or so acres surrounding Annaburg, that today is the Annaburg subdivision, that basically goes from Main Street, Quarry Street, and Centerville Road and Sudley Road, like that whole area, that was commonly known as Portner Park. And so that was an area that was open to the residents to be able to come and stroll through the paths, to use the ponds for ice skating in the summer. I mean, he was very civic minded. Um, People who aren't from Manassas don't know this, but in his will, he left several bequests where he left $5,000 to the Masonic Lodge for a new temple. He left $5,000 for the paving of Main Street, and he left $5,000 for the indigent of Manassas. And he specifically dictated that a third of that be used for the African American population. So, I mean, he was incredibly civic minded. So I think that's another reason that Manassas has a vested interest in preserving this landmark.
So it sounds like it's fair to say that Annaburg and Robert Portner may be responsible for the revitalization of the community after the Civil War. Would you say that's fair?
Absolutely. Definitely.
So you touched on this a bit already, but I was wondering what makes the house itself so architecturally significant.
So it's a really unique house. It's not like the Winchester House in California unique, but it is very interesting. For the longest time, everybody assumed that the architect was a gentleman by the name of Oscar Bott. Oscar was a Washington-based architect who did design the Masonic Temple, um, and I believed he may have designed the Portner's Prince William Hotel there in Manassas. But at the time that Annaburg was designed, Vaught was only 19 years old. So I know Portner would not have enlisted somebody so young and inexperienced to design such an incredible place for him. He actually ended up, and I recently found this out, he enlisted the aid of a Washington architect by the name of Gustav Freebus. Um, Freebus and his brother Theodore had a really strong business connection with Portner in Washington. The brother Theodore, actually, it was a bit of a real estate broker. And so as Portner was developing his real estate interests in Washington, Theodore Freebus is the one who really cultivated that business for him. So Portner and Gustav Freebus, they designed Annaburg, and they worked hand in hand designing it. So it combined a lot of the elements of Porter's favorite European mansions. Uh, it's an architect that I've spoken with recently. They described it as neoclassical with Prussian influence. So because Portner and Freebus both were from Prussia, and they described it as the streaky bacon look, because it's the buff brick, but it has the streaks of the dark brown sandstone running through the facade of it. Um, to me, architecturally, it's very interesting because there is a beautiful balance between symmetrical and asymmetry as well. So if you look at the front, or I'm sorry, the south facade of the house, which would be considered the front of the house, you'll see on the left of the porch, there's a big Palladian window, but on the right are two windows. But then on the second floor, it's two windows and two windows. So there is a nice balance of symmetry and asymmetry. On the left, he had a square carriage porch that the carriages would come under, but then on the right was a matching porch, but it was round instead of square. So I don't know, I think architecturally it was quirky, but deliberately so, and just quite beautiful.
Why do you think that there's so much disagreement about the history of air conditioning out there?
Um, I think it kind of looks, or it kind of goes to what your definition of it is, and the practical process of it. So if you think about air conditioning as we know it today, then it's not the same system that Portner invented. And at the time that Portner created his or invented his direct ammonia expansion, the patent office was being flooded at that point with patents, because somebody would see something, they would create something, and then Portner did this a lot. He would see somebody's invention, he would buy his own version of it, and he was incredibly scientific minded. So what he would do is he would completely disassemble the entire thing, and then reassemble it and look for ways to improve it to make it better. And so that's why you have all these like patent after patent after patent of people doing this. So depending on how you look at it, I mean, there's really no way to prove that Annaburg is the first house in the country to have air conditioning. That's why there's always a caveat of it is believed to be, because like I said, there's just no way to really quantify it. So I don't know. I think it's more of just a not something. Not it's not like a knockdown fisticuffs debate or anything like that. But it's just like, it's okay. You can say it, I can say it, and you have to look at like the specifics of it. But I think it just comes down to how you view air conditioning and the mechanics behind it.
So what type of beer was Portner brewing?
Oh gosh, what kind wasn't he? He had a lot of different styles over the years. His biggest one was the lager style beer, which Germans are responsible for introducing that to the United States. Um, with the lager beer process, you have to have certain temperatures to be able to brew it, and so it all started out in beer cellars underground, because you can keep a more cooler, controlled temperature down there. So that his Vienna cabinet and his Tivoli export, those were two of his biggest brands. He did branch out over time. He made something called a Kumbacher, which I haven't figured out yet what kind of beer that was. He also made a cream porter. He made what was the other one? He made some light beers. I mean, he really tried a bunch of different kinds. He also got into malt extract, which was considered a healthful tonic at the time. So I mean, he really did dabble. Oh, Bach beer. That was a big one that he did. And not a lot of people know about that one, but newspaper accounts, I mean, have it like every year. It was a big announcement when that one came out, and I mean, it was advertised all up and down the eastern seaboard because of where its depots were. And it was something it was basically, it took about a year and a half to make, and they only shipped out a limited supply and saying, okay, it's arriving, it's for sale this day, and it's only on sale for this time. So that was probably arguably one of his best specialty beers that he ever made.
Seems like it took a lot of courage to move to Northern Virginia at the beginning of the Civil War. Was he aware of what he was getting into?
Oh yeah. He when he came to America in 1853. Two of his brothers had actually come to America already, and by the time that he graduated from the military academy, Castle Annaburg in Germany, um, his two brothers here encouraged Robert and another brother to come to America. So they all settled in New York, and they got into a routine there. He bounced around between working in his brother's pie factory, working in a bone factory, working for a grocery store. He really did bounce around between a lot of occupations. And it should be noted that he actually taught himself English by just simply reading newspapers. So he was able to become fully bilingual. Um, when the Civil War broke out, and he actually says this in his diary, he went to Virginia because he wanted to see it. He wanted to see what was going on. And I'm sure, like a lot of other people, he thought it was going to be this one and done skirmish, and it was over. So he and Fred Recker came to Alexandria from New York, or I'm sorry, they came to Washington from New York, and then they were able to get a pass over to Alexandria. And I guess after seeing I don't think that they went out to Manassas to see the battle, but just seeing what was going on, they kind of realized that this isn't going away. And they were able to get a loan and buy up a grocery store and start a business there that basically they were selling to the local regiments that were there. They started out with what little they had. It's like butter and fruit basically, and then gradually they were able to get more and more supplies. So he knew what he was getting into, and he made the most of it, to the point where when they started brewing beer in 1862, um, they were actually the only ones that were allowed by the provisional government to brew and sell to, I'm sorry, not the only ones allowed to brew, but they were the only ones allowed to sell to the troops there.
So you mentioned that he left a significant amount of money in his will to the African American community's benefit. Can you speak a bit about in what ways that benefited the community?
It was a fund to basically help the poor. And, he died in 1906. And I'm not really sure what the socioeconomic situation in Manassas was at that point. But like I said, I mean, he left $5,000 in this trust fund and dictated that like a third of it be used for the African American community. And it's been very well managed to the point that the fund is still active today. It's I don't know what the name of it is, but somebody within the city government has told me that the fund is still there and still going. So it I just think that it was really beneficial. But not only that, but he also was very quick to hire African Americans to work in his brewery in Alexandria, as well as he had I mean, breweries had large German populations amongst their employees, but he definitely did hire a large number of African Americans. And there's plenty of accounts of his generosity for his employees. He gave them all turkeys at Christmas and Thanksgiving. He helped clothe them when need be. So I mean, he was just very, very generous and very civic minded for all of his employees.
So Annaburg at its height is sitting on 2,100 acres.
Mhm.
Today, of course, it's sort of in the middle of a suburb. At what point does Annaburg's property begin to shrink and the city grow around it?
So the family, after Robert died in 1906, his wife continued to use Annaburg until her death in 1912. After her death, one of the sons lived there pretty regularly. First, it was Herman, who then died in 1916, and then Paul, who died in 1919. And another son, Oscar, he lived on a third house on the property called Windermere, which stood approximately where Weems Elementary School now is. Oscar and his family moved to D.C. Around 1920, and that was the last time anybody really lived at Annaburg in the family. They would still use it for about a week or so each summer as a little getaway, but by that point, the family they were more engaged in their business activities in Washington. By 1920, the brewery was no longer operating; it had become a feed and grain business, and the bulk of the family business was actually real estate in Washington. So the family became very concentrated in Washington. By about the 1923 or so, I believe there was a big auction to sort of sell off a lot of the contents of the house. And from that point on, the family just really didn't go there anymore. The last son died in 1931, and all the daughters were leading lives as socialite wives. By 1947, the family decided to sell the estate. Farming was still active in the area, but you could tell, like with the federal government and just like the explosion of employment up there, large scale farming, especially to the degree of Annaburg, was going by the wayside. So they decided I hate to use this term, but Annaburg almost had become an albatross for them. So they decided it was just best to divest themselves of it. And so they sold the entire estate to I.J. Breeden. And over the next, well, really up until Breeden's death in the 1990s, I mean, Breeden was continually developing the estate. Certain portions he sold to other people who developed them. Breeden did his own developing. The area around Annaburg specifically became the Annaburg subdivision. Then the area to the north of Sudley Road, between Grant and Centerville Road, became the Liberia subdivision. So he started doing both residential and commercial development. So I think really from about probably the early 1950s is where Annaburg started to really significantly shrink in size and become what we know of it as today. Uh, what's really interesting is there's a website that you can look at aerial maps of different time periods. You can use a scroll bar to sort of go back and forth between them. And so if you use the scroll bar between now and the 1950s, you can actually see Annaburg, and you can see where they had started to lay out the roads, but you can still see the paths and the large flower gardens and stuff of the original estate. So seeing um, that development, that change right there in the 50s, that was really the most, like, that's when you say, okay, this is where it's becoming what we know today.
It reminds me a bit of Hearst Castle out in California because William Randolph Hearst had all these various curiosities, animals from various portions of the world. I know he had zebras roaming around, and that kind of reminded me a bit of Robert Portner's house. What were some of the more interesting curiosities that he had on his property?
Um, well, he imported he imported a lot of stuff for his property. His diary is full of accounts of him taking long trips over to Europe, and it doesn't say I went to Europe and I came back, but I mean it actually says what countries he went to and what they did. Um, there was a period in the late 1880s that he was actually in Europe and Germany for about 2.5, almost 3 years. Um, so I mean, he always brought stuff back with him. When he was building Annaburg, he imported Italian marble for the fireplaces. He imported statuary from Greece. We know that he imported trees from the Black Forest of Germany to be planted on the estate, and it's been said that if any state tree that was a part of the Union at that time, if their state tree could grow in Virginia's climate, he had it imported and planted on the estate. I believe that there's some of the existing trees came from Japan. Um, there's been newspaper accounts about how he bought horses from Russia. So I mean, he was just really big on just importing whatever he could. But I'd say the most interesting or curious thing on the estate was the Portner Tower. It sat to the left of the house, and it was a 3-story brownstone structure that whether or not it had a purpose is up for debate. People have, there's so many little urban legends about it. Uh, but it was 3 stories, and it was said to be a replica of a castle turret on the Rhine River near his homeland. So it was his own reminder of his homeland. And when he built Annaburg, Mrs. Portner's family apparently was a little more affluent than his own family. So her family coat of arms is on the side of the house, and it's when it was a nursing home, they actually they framed it out in a hallway that led between the house and the east wing, whereas his family coat of arms was on the tower. So it was just this beautiful, imposing structure. It had a big flagpole on it. Supposedly, he had a cannon out front that he would fire off. And then some have said that he used the tower as a wine cellar. Some have said that he used it as a museum for all the Civil War relics that he found on the property. Someone even said that one of the sons collected suits of armor and kept them inside. Now, whether or not that's true, I have absolutely no idea. But yeah, I'd say the Portner Tower is probably the most curious thing that was on the estate.
So, through the course of researching for this book, did you get to speak to anybody connected to Robert Portner, his family, descendants, etc.?
Oh yeah. When I started just researching it just out of sheer curiosity. In high school, my first job was working in the nursing home, and I saw the house. I fell in love with it just on the first look. I was like, "Why is this here?" So I went to the museum and started doing some cursory research, and I found a letter that was written by one of the great granddaughters. So I got her address and I wrote to her, and it kind of just went from there. And I just gradually started writing to family members just out of the blue, saying, this is who I am, this is what I'm doing. Anything that you want to share could be helpful. And I mean, I've become very close with several members of the family. I've become an honorary member of the family. And they're wonderful people. They've been very, very generous with their time, with their memories. sharing family photos. Um, I mean, they're just. I mean, they've invited me into their homes. They're they're great. There's one grandchild left living, Barbara, and she's a pistol. She's in her 90s, and she still has beautiful penmanship. She she is just as sharp in her mind as she can be. She was actually very gracious in donating several artifacts to the museum exhibit we did on the Portners a couple years ago. Um, yeah, they when I was at Annaburg a couple weeks ago for the task force meeting, I brought Peggy Portner with me as my guest, and she brought her son Jay. And so the family is very aware of Annaburg still, what's going on with it. They're still very engaged, even though they're across the country. But yeah, the family has just been absolutely wonderful in sharing themselves with me and with this book.
So what kind of interesting information did they yield?
They really gave really interesting perspectives on things. Because when you're doing historic research, you really, without the family, you only have contemporary accounts from newspapers and what other people have researched. So they were able to really give really make a like personified, I guess, like make it personal, make it real. I remember Peggy saying that she remembers when the Portner apartment building in DC. By the time that she was born, it had been sold and converted into the Dunbar Hotel, but her family had a big doormat that came from the Portner Hotel that had it said the Portner, and so she grew up thinking like everybody had personalized mats like that in front of their house. So it was just somebody who comes from just like I come from basic farming stock. Like there's nothing great or opulent about my family. So the Portners, I feel like I'm a lot like basically like a lot of the people in Manassas. So the Portners they were local royalty. People held a reverence for them. And so even though that has kind of diminished over the years since Robert Portner's death, there still is a reverie for them. And so really speaking with them and just like I said, they were able to just really make it like put a person and a feeling and a family behind it. And they've just, they shared anecdotes. They told me about just like just their own personal experiences of what it was like growing up Portner.
So is there any historical work left to be done? Any gaps in the historical record surrounding Robert Portner and Annaburg?
Oh God, yes. I mean, I've been researching this for over 25 years, and there's still so much that I don't know. Um, One of the things that has gnawed at me the entire time is the fact that we cannot find floor plans to Annaburg, and I'm convinced at this point they don't exist. Like they have disappeared. But it's one of the, like it was I will still search for them until my last breath. Um, but I mean, yeah, there's still a lot that we don't know. The newspapers in Manassas were only published once a week at that point, whereas the newspapers in Alexandria and Washington were published daily. So, you know, the papers in Alexandria and Washington, they give really good accounts, and they have columns like items from Prince William. But so those were based on what people would tell them. So there's still a lot in the Manassas record that that we don't know, like who all was involved with building the house. And we have some names, but there's still a lot of missing information. I want to know more about the Portner Brownstone Company, which is where the majority of the brownstone for Annaburg, for the tower, and a lot of local buildings came from. Um, so yeah, and I know like I have a running list. There's a lot that I still want to try to research and find out about.
So is there a second book we can expect from you?
I am currently working on a third edition. It is definitely slower going than I was hoping, just because I am in my senior year here at Appalachian State, and it's incredibly time consuming with studios and whatnot. But I am working on the third edition, so it is coming for sure.
So 2018, the city buys Annaburg. What would you like to see happen to it, and what role do you think it could play in the community going forward?
Um, oh gosh, that's a lot to unpack. Like what I would like to see for it, I definitely want to see it becoming something very community oriented. Um, I love the idea of fully restoring the first floor, because that's the one floor of the building that remains virtually untouched from when the Portners were in residence. Uh, so we can almost accurately restore that. So yeah, I want to definitely see the first floor restored and used for event space. Um, the second floor and third floor, when Annaburg was turned into a nursing home, the second and third floors were turned into private apartments for residents. So bathrooms were added, walls were changed, doors were moved. And so without those original floor plans, short of stripping everything down to original bare bones, we really have no idea of knowing what the original configuration was. So the second and third floors could easily become office space for the city or another venture or something. Um, there is a middle room on the second floor that opens out onto the round porch above the main front porch, and I believe that was a sitting room with Mr. and Mrs. Portner's bedrooms on opposite sides. Um, I think that would be great to become a bridal room. That should there be weddings there, that the brides could get ready in that room. Maybe even put a resident caretaker apartment on the third floor if possible. Um, the grounds definitely want to see. I definitely want to see them changed a little bit to sort of go back to a more historic appearance. Maybe putting down crushed gravel where the original drive was, keeping the parking lot off to the side, obviously, but depending on what the future outcome of the house is, taking up all of the asphalt that's in the front drive and restoring that back to a garden circle. Putting some sort of a memorial out where the tower was, something similar to what they did at Jenny Dean with the low walls. Um, Definitely identify the plantings that are on the property, and maybe even replant some historically accurate things. Um, so yeah, I definitely want to see it become something that can be more community engaged. I want it to offer as a park something that the other parks don't have, because a lot of parks that they have playgrounds and stuff like that, or community gardens. And given where Annaburg is situated, I don't think a community garden is good, because everybody around the area has yards and they have their own space for gardens. So I definitely want it to be something that, um, yeah, definitely is very supportive of all aspects of the community.
Well, that does it for my questions. The Shortest Dynasty is available in our store, the Manassas Museum Store. And thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for
We
having me.
appreciate it.
Anytime.